Hello. Good afternoon, and thank you so much to everyone for coming. We're absolutely delighted to be here with you all, and a very warm welcome to all our speakers who are joining us today. And welcome to this Future Lab on reconfiguring the law in line with the science. My name is Fiona Macklin. I'm part of the Climate Champions team, and I manage a campaign called Race to Zero. And this campaign is led by two UN climate change high-level champions whose role is really to bring together non-state actors, so the cities, the regions, the businesses, the financial institutions across the global economy, to commit voluntarily to robust science-aligned net zero targets, really racing to halve emissions by 2030. And over the last couple of years, we've seen a huge proliferation in net zero targets, from 16% of coverage of the GDP back in 2019 to over 90% today. But we all know, I'm sure, in this room, that those net zero targets are not created equal. And one of the things that we've tried to do with Race to Zero as a campaign is really separate the wheat from the chaff, make sure that we are showing what good net zero looks like and encouraging, urging these non-state actors to get on board so that we can deliver a robust net zero for the world and a just future. In doing so and in working with this campaign, we work with partner initiatives across the world who are themselves supporting these cities, these regions, these businesses, these financial institutions to deliver on reducing emissions. And already we've seen huge progress. It's been so exciting to be part of this campaign for the last 2 years. And just for some snippets of examples of actions taking place across the world, we've seen Mumbai on its way to having 5,000 buses by 2026, all powered by renewable energy. We've seen even this week 300 financial institutions setting really robust 1.5 degree aligned targets, including across their portfolios to align with 1.5. We've also seen recently Fortescue, the huge mining giant, update its world-leading heavy industry decarbonisation strategy to eliminate fossil fuels and achieve real zero terrestrial emissions by 2030. That is a massive step for an organisation in a hard-to-abate sector. So this progress is happening, but it's not enough. It's still voluntary, and we are nowhere near where we need to be to halve emissions globally by 2030. So despite this progress, we know that voluntary action alone cannot get us to deliver the Paris Agreement. And that's why we need a real pivot point. We need a dramatic acceleration in the conversion from the groundswell of voluntary momentum into ground rules for the global economy. We need to restructure a global infrastructure that is fit for purpose. And the law has a tremendous and crucial role to play in that. We recently observed the law be weaponized by Republican attorneys general in the US and states attempting to really fuel a backlash against ESG, or even be twisted by laggards who aren't prepared to step up and do what it takes to really advance climate action. And these attorneys general or these laggards are pointing, for instance, to anti-collusion laws or fiduciary duties to really halt this progress in climate action, and that needs to be reversed. We really need to ensure that the law, instead of holding us back, is a real tool for helping to accelerate this action. And actually, even this week, we've seen some really positive progress in this pivot towards more mature regulatory infrastructure. We've seen the ISSB partner with CDP to harmonize disclosure standards. We've seen Biden announce requirements for suppliers to the White House needing to have science-based targets. And we've seen the launch of the ISO net zero guidelines that are really demonstrating a general sense and harmonization of what good looks like across international standards. And these are fantastic. But we need much more, and we need them much faster. So to do so, we really need to better connect these non-state actors with these regulatory tools to make sure that we're all driving together forwards towards the same goal. And that's why today I'm so excited to be having two panels on this topic. First, to think really about what is it that businesses can do and are already doing to use law in favor of accelerating climate action within their business models, but also to explore then at a higher level, what is it that the law can do to help with this transition and perhaps pivot at an infrastructure level to get to where we need to go. So really looking forward to hearing these two panels. But before we shift to panels, I'm absolutely delighted to invite Alexia Leclerc onto stage. Alexia is an environmental justice organizer from Texas with a background in law and is going to tell us a little bit about her future, or her vision rather, for the future in this space. So Alexia, welcome and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me and for hosting this incredible panel on such an important topic. So my name is Alexia. I'm from Texas, where the petrochemical industry plays a very prominent role in our economy and in our communities. And unfortunately, that comes as a cost. So communities of color across Texas are disproportionately impacted and have died and are still dying of cancer due to living in proximity to those petrochemical industry. And so that's kind of how I came into contact with the law. We sued petrochemical industries for violating the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, most recently used NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, as a tool to ensure that our communities are also getting access to clean and healthy environment. But what we found was that sometimes it was very cyclical. Under different administrations, different laws were changed differently. For example, NEPA was largely gutted out under Trump. And even recently, there was attempts to pass the permitting side deal, which would have significantly cut back public participation, especially from communities of color in the process of creating it. And so what we've done in the past 3 years is actually written the Environmental Justice for All Act in the United States. And the reason I want to talk about that to an audience that might not be from the United States and be an international audience is because the way we went about in writing this policy was to start by discussing with those that were most impacted. We toured the United States, went to different communities, and worked with legislators and Congress representatives to talk to those that were impacted by the issue and to understand their perspective and understand their local solutions and how that can be incorporated into the law we're now proposing. I think it is extremely crucial because at the end of the day, the law is a tool that we use, and who creates the law and which perspectives we have around it and how we utilize and implement the law is shaped by those who are creating it and those identities that we might hold or might not hold and the knowledge and the perspective that we have. Another thing that I've seen increasingly being used across the world is the rights of nature. For example, for me, ever since I was little, my mom taught me that we aren't separate from each other, that we aren't separate from the earth, and that everything is sacred. But that is very different from the legal framework that we currently have in the United States. But we've seen across the world that people are fighting for the rights of nature itself, the rights that rivers might have, that trees might hold. And I think that is something that is extremely important to explore and how we can incorporate indigenous wisdom into our laws and use that as a way to protect the environment. Most recently, I've been doing some work at the UN level, which is why I'm here at COP27. And as we know, a lot of the agreements that are made are not legally binding in the different countries, which poses a problem because we can agree to as many funding structures as we want or commit to 1.5, but if we don't actually have the mechanisms to implement them back in the different legal systems in the different countries, then we come and meet again and again, and we still haven't met our goals, which was why we still find ourselves today with the climate crisis. And so I think it's really important for us to explore what the legal frameworks can be used to hold all these corporations accountable and to hold the countries accountable to the promises that they are making in the COP space, and to understand where we can bridge the gap from the legal systems in individual countries with the international system that we currently have set up. And we, again, need to work with those that are most impacted, which often come on observer badges, but really need to be in the room in every single negotiation and every single bilateral to make sure that our perspectives, our knowledges, our wisdoms are incorporated. And so I'm going to leave it to the experts on the panel to go more into detail about the law. But if there's anything that I hope you remember from what I've said, is that at the end of the day, the law is just a tool. It is neutral on its own. But the way that we can shape it, that we can weaponize it, creates a huge impact. And so it is really important that we have those that are most impacted be the ones guiding the discussion on how our legal frameworks are created and are implemented to make sure that we are actually moving towards a more sustainable future. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Alexia. What a powerful statement. With no further ado, and off the back of that really thought-provoking ending, I'm going to warmly invite Gonzalo Munoz, founder of Sistema B and previously COP25 high-level champion, to the stage to welcome our first panel. Gonzalo, thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, Fee. Well, it's a real honor to be here and crucial to be addressing this topic. I've been dedicating at least the last 20 years of my life to use business as a force for good. I've done it through mobilizing the circular economy, mostly in Latin America, but all around the world, and implementing it in different business models, even by myself, through the food and ag business as well. Also, of course, I've been doing that in the last year through the climate action in different ways. As also, I am proud to be a member, a founder of the global B Corp movement through Sistema B. In all of those cases, we started with voluntarism. We started with the idea of people that were moved by the values, by their core spirit, ethics, their moral, but then at the end, what do we expect is to change the rules of the game, right? Voluntarism is extremely important. We need the innovators. We need those that are capable of moving the borders of what is possible. But at the end, what we need to do is change the system, or improve the system, I would say. And of course, normally when you come with an innovation, they will first ignore you, then will laugh at you, then they will fight you, but at the end, you win, right? I would say that initially, you're obviously invisible and irrelevant. Then you might become visible, but probably yet irrelevant. You will only become visible and relevant when you're changing the rules of the game. And that will happen through massive impact, and at the end, by promoting the right type of legislation. We know that oftenly the law is perceived as a stick, but it should and it can be also a way to stimulate the right changes that we require. When it comes to the amazing campaign that I had the privilege to co-lead with my brother, Nigel Topping, and now that Nigel is co-leading with Mahmoud, where we have an amazing a group of experts, the Race to Zero expert group led by Tom here, and then the work that Fee has been doing through Race to Zero, but also Juanita there through the Race to Resilience. In those campaigns, we have a 5P logic. It all starts with a pledge. It's absolutely relevant to have people that are capable of confronting the uncertainty and say, this is the world that I want to create, and I will create it by my own commitment and with others. That's great, and we have seen a massive increase of commitments. The second thing is to plan, and you have to plan according to science. You have to plan according to the rules that are common, and in this case is the UN creating the conditions. Then you have to proceed. You have to start moving yourself. You have to publish. You have to be transparent. But the fifth P is the one that is bringing us here. It's about persuade. It's about policy. And we will only succeed if we reach that last P, if we move all of those amazing commitments that we have had in the last years to finally persuade the system in the right direction through a net zero and resilient commitments and action. So in that sense, I'm more than pleased to be moderating a great panel, and I will be calling the members of the panel into stage. I will name them. So first, Andreas Gunst, the partner at DLA Piper. Andreas, thanks so much for joining. Second, Jojo Mehta, please, round of applause. Jojo, the founder of Stop Ecocide. Thanks so much, Jojo. Mark Jankovic, CEO of Delphis Eco. Mark, thanks for coming. And last but not least, Sophie Punte, Director of Policy of Women Business. Sophie, thanks so much. So thanks, please sit and join me. I think that I took the wrong microphone. Oh, this is yours. Right. Great. There we are. So the topic, of course, is how can business use these legal structures to change the operating models to facilitate and accelerate climate action. And I will start with you, Andreas. I would like to, no, sorry, I will start with Jojo. So Jojo, yeah. What is at stake if business continue business as usual? Say it's not only what we want to see, what is the risk that we're confronting if we don't do the right things?
Hello. Hi, everybody. What is at stake if we continue business as usual? Well, I mean, to be honest, I think the simple answer is pretty much everything. Civilization as we know it, in the sense that, if we continue, as we have been, we're looking at all the consequences that we've been, shown over the last few years about what can happen when global heating goes as it does, whether the issues with food security, migration, ultimately resource conflicts, all of those things. But it's also not just emissions that we're talking about here. We have to consider the vital ecosystems as well. I mean, effectively, even if we ceased all emissions tomorrow, if we continue to denude forests, to destroy wetlands and mangroves, to effectively damage and destroy those ecosystems that preserve and that enable us to live healthily on this planet, we will still have a deepening climate crisis. So, what we're needing to look for here, and I loved Gonzalo's introduction because it really sort of put the finger on that sort of dual role of law, both the sort of the stick and the carrot, if you like, is that what we're really missing here, we feel certainly at the Stop Ecocide Foundation, is the outer parameter, a kind of a guardrail, that basically says, beyond this level of harm is simply not safe. And so we need to put those, those boundaries in place, because otherwise, truly everything that has functioned as we know it in the last decades will be at stake.
Yep, I think we all agree on that. So thanks, Jojo, for pointing it very clearly. Sophie, from the corporate perspective, what is the role of businesses in general? And if I may, most of you might think about the big corporations, but then sure, there are also value chains that are sometimes even more relevant on creating the trajectory. And in that sense, women business has been really relevant on helping us to promote the SME Climate Hub, right? So what is the role of all of those businesses in advocating for policies and mature regulation infrastructure to accelerate climate action?
Well, I try to keep it simple because I could easily talk an hour about this. But there's two dimensions. Actually, there's three. But the one, it's about being active. And you might all heard of an organization called Influence Map. And they map companies, whether they're active and whether they're responsible or climate aligned. And it's those two dimensions. And I would love to introduce a third one, and that's inclusive. And that's exactly because in addition to companies being active on policy engagement and not being green hushers, or not saying anything, they should also be responsible, and that's not being green washers, but include SMEs in the supply chain, include the staff in their organizations, because maybe a medium level manager in a company might engage with a policy analyst at a ministry to help them, right? So it's not just at the high level, it's across the company. And the way they can do it is, first, being active is about committing to speak up and speaking up. I want to give a concrete example that you might not have heard of, but I know from my past living in Asia. Scania was in Beijing. They were setting up new standards for trucking. The sizes and dimensions was a massive piece of regulation. And Scania helped them understand how do we need to make those dimensions so that there's a consistency between trucks going regional rural and urban? How do we make sure it really meets what industry needs to transport goods in the most efficient way? How do we make sure that we can already add aerodynamic features to the trucks rather than having to change the regulations later? So combining the expertise of the sector you're in with the understanding of what the legislation is trying to achieve, and using your voice to promote better legislation, but also giving your expertise to make sure that it works for business in practice is absolutely critical. Yeah. The second one is then about the responsibility, right? And making sure that companies are aligning their own advocacy, like, yay, we support net zero, with what they're doing through the trade associations. And recently we've all heard the IRA Act being passed in the US, but there were several companies that publicly are really committed to climate change, but if the IRA was gonna make them pay more taxes, we're via trade associations trying to undercut that. And that cannot happen. Companies must be responsible. And the inclusive one I already mentioned is that companies try to look at how can they build capacity within their company, so that every level there's a link about, well, how could we support governments doing this? Why? Because the risk is, in addition to what you just said, that policy and standards are going to lag too far behind the ambition and action that companies want to take. And that is a key risk, and it would be a missed opportunity.
Absolutely. Agree on everything. And we cannot miss any opportunity. We don't have time for doing that. Mark, I would like to, you as a CEO, if you can share with us your reflections on what are those most powerful legal tools for business to deploy internally to align with net zero, and if you can also align externally in your value chain as well.
Thanks, Gonzalo. So my business, I'm a recovering banker. I woke up one day and said, I genuinely dislike all the rubbish that I see on the street, and how can I create a business that kind of focus in on that, and Delft Eco makes cleaning products that are completely aligned with sustainability, externally and internally. So we need laws externally, and I'll give an example. One of our customers wanted us to create an eco range for them, and it was all signed off until it got to the lawyers, and the lawyers said, oh no, we don't understand what eco stands for, therefore we're not passing this product as a new product SKU to go through the system. So we absolutely need to align the external laws. Internally, I think there are a few, they're limited levers. So whether you're a B Corp or you're not a B Corp, you can change your articles of association. That is something that's really, really easy to do. And if you're not a B Corp, go onto the B Corp website and just hack that page and take the wording and put it in your articles of association. And I think then you go drop down into how do you incentivize your staff? And there's two levels there. There's, can I build in a incentive program for my staff so that they behave better and they are aligned with the vision and mission? And I think the soft piece there is, are we a member of Race to Zero? Are we a B Corp? Can we build in that kind of social, cultural element where all of the employees are 100% aligned with the vision and mission of the board and the sign up to those principles within the Articles of Association?
Thanks so much. As you can imagine, I love the B Corp part. You're all being mapped now, your cell phones are being tracked, so you're going to be released when you sign the B Corp commitment. So, Andreas, you're the legal expert, but I'm the only one wearing a tie. I thought this was going to be a tie, so I wear it just by coming in here. I wasn't wearing a tie the whole 2 weeks, but now I said, okay, in this panel I have to wear a tie, but you're the legal expert. I'm so sorry for that. Should I remove my tie? What are those opportunities and tools for business to use to shift their internal business models? And if you can refer also globally or certain regions.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously quite a lot in that, but maybe one of the really important thing, and that was already sort of addressed just in the previous comments, is the point that there's a really great deal of uncertainty what you can say outside without basically misrepresenting. And that's something that's been going through the industry for the last 20 years. I've been doing renewable energy projects and carbon projects since 2005. so almost 20 years. And that issue has never really changed. You thought sort of after 20 years you're probably there and have a bit more clarity, but in terms of what people can actually say is, in terms of, net zero, carbon neutral, offsetting, etc., really, really difficult. And I think that in a way we've been working with one of the standards to just set up effectively a set of rules around what can you realistically say in the context of your offsetting your renewable energy without falling foul of those rules. And I think what a lot of participants need to recognize in this is that we are using quite a lot of legal fictions in this market when it comes to hydrogen, when it comes to renewables. We're never really buying renewable power. I've used yesterday in a presentation the example of buying fair trade coffee. And if you went out to the coffee stand outside there and you bought 2 cups of fair trade coffee, and the person next to you just bought normal coffee, and the barista will give you, 1 cup of fair trade coffee and 1 not, you would be outraged because you bought fair trade coffee, right? But the reality is that a lot of these issues that we have in the market, be it hydrogen, be it biofuels, be it renewable energy that are supposed to be, the game changers for all of this, have exactly the same problem. We've not overcome the issue in our market to say, fine, I'm happy to pay for something and for somebody else to get the benefit. And you see that as a sort of issue running through nearly everything in this market. It comes from renewable energy support schemes. No, I'm just doing them nationally because I don't want anybody else to participate from this. But, we have that in the Article 6 discussion, and we have another flight, which is exactly the same point as, how do you equitably share that? We have it in renewable energy because the power that you're off taking from the grid is grid average at any point in time, right? You never buy renewable energy. You always buy grid average, at least until the point that the grid has full renewables. And getting that right and getting people to understand that there needs to be a process where you recognize I may be paying for something and might not get my cup of fair trade coffee, or I might not get my green hydrogen, or might not get my renewable energy, is so fundamentally important to this, because it is really the core issue that then creates all of these issues around misrepresentation, competition law related issues that people hide behind, and all of those things. So if there's one thing to address in it, I know you said sort of global and regional, but I think that actually the issues, at least, and I've been working Latin America, US, Europe, Africa, Asia on these projects, is always the same issue. And we've not overcome that after 20 years, and that's quite frustrating. We're working on a lot of certification schemes. We're working on a lot of schemes that help us to sort of better understand and communicate this, but there needs to be a fundamental buy-in that says, fine, I'm happy to pay for something, to support something, and for somebody else to take at least part of the benefit of that. And until we don't come to that sharing arrangement, we're just going to run around the whole thing in circles as we've been doing for the last 20 years.
Well, tough to hear, but yeah, makes sense. And thanks for that, Andrea. Jojo, as a founder of Stop Ecocide, and having worked with many companies around the world, and again, I would love if you can even try to segregate when we speak about business, which type of business, in which region, if you can, size, type, sector. How have you gone about bringing on board those business to support you and Stop Ecocide?
Thank you for that. And for those who are not familiar with what we do, we develop global cross-sector support for an international crime of ecocide. In other words, to add mass damage and destruction of nature to the list of crimes that currently includes war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. So it's really going to the very top level to create that absolute sort of outer parameter, or if you like, foundational piece, because one of the things, and actually this has emerged hugely over the last few days here at COP, is that so many people are talking about the sort of damage that is happening to the natural environment and to the climate, and saying, well, you know, actually there are rules in place. There's a whole body of environmental law, but it's actually very badly enforced and very badly followed. So what we aim to do is to put that kind of foundational piece in place that actually shores up the whole sort of broader body of environmental law. And I think when it comes to the business side of things, there are sort of three key elements that really have helped to engage the corporate world in this narrative. And the first one is actually understanding the potential of criminal law, and actually perhaps getting out of that initial reaction to criminal law, which tends to be that, you know, as I say, that seeing it as a stick or what have you. And really what a criminal law is there for is protection. I mean, effectively, murder is a crime to stop people being killed, right? So the idea of putting in place a crime that says, you know, this much damage is simply not acceptable, if you like, creates a level of a sort of a guardrail and a deterrence that protects. And that is what we're ultimately aiming to do. But it also creates a sort of enabling condition. Now, there's a huge frustration, and it's been growing for years, and I'm sure we're all aware of it, at the kind of pace of climate action. You know, there's plenty of goodwill, but it's all moving rather slowly. And so having a kind of a rule in place that simply says, whatever you do, and this is not about demonizing any particular industry or sector at all. And in fact, the consensus legal definition that emerged last year for ecocide, which is literally a line long, so I'll tell you what it is. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Now, what that does, as I say, it doesn't aim at any particular industry, but what it says is whatever you're doing, it's how you're doing it and the scale at which you're doing it that you need to pay attention to, because actually that it's at the edges of those things that the damage occurs. And so it's looking at creating that parameter and enabling all those sort of positive actions and strategies to move forward. Because, of course, what it also does, and this is the second element, is it levels the playing field. So there are so many sustainable initiatives out there. There are so many positive projects, plans, initiatives that are all moving at policy level, at corporate level. But at the moment, they still all feel like an uphill struggle, because finance, as I think we probably all know, you know, it's kind of like water. It will flow where it's allowed to flow. So if we want it to start flowing in new directions, we do need to put some outer parameters in place that prevent it from constantly flowing in the direction that it's flown. And I do think that that is flowed, and I think this will potentially affect what you were just talking about a moment ago, is that once certain doors are closed, it makes it so much easier to move in new directions. And the other thing that we've found, and this is different with different sectors, so this speaks to what you were just saying, Gonzalo, is that when you put that definition in front of somebody who knows their sector, what happens is they look at that definition and immediately they come up with often half a dozen very specific questions. You know, how will this affect, you know, I don't know, the concrete we use, or how will this affect, you know, the approach we use in this particular context, or, you know, the way that our engineers approach this. Now, that is gold dust. Because part of the problem at the moment is that the right questions are not being asked because we don't quite know what they are. So when you put that framework in place and you put that in front of somebody who knows their field, then they're going to say, okay, well, what are the questions we need to ask? And this is the beauty for us, you know, this is the beauty of the human brain. You know, when we think about how much finance, how much intellectual capital, how much actual capital has been put into the development of practices that we now know are destructive, there's no way that you can tell me that all of that cannot be put in a better direction given the right framework. So that is a real positive around putting this in place. And finally, and I believe this is why and networks like, for example, the International Corporate Governance Network, which is an investor-led network made up of the biggest financial firms in the world. I mean, they manage 70 trillion in global assets. They've put a statement in 2 years in a row now to the COPs, last year and this year, in which they recommend governments to mandate regulation and collaborate internationally to criminalize ecocide. And we went back to them and said, this is wonderful. How comes your committee came up with this when they were putting their statement together? And they said two things. One was a key thing about stabilization of risk. Is about knowing what are the rules that are going to be coming into play. How do we make sure that our financial investments have that we can predict what's going to happen there? But also, of course, that stabilizes operational risk and it stabilizes reputational risk as well. So those are really, really key factors in having such a law in place. But the second thing they said, and this was deeply encouraging, what they said is, our people were simply looking out at the world and saying, this is really serious what's going on. We need a really serious, set of rules to actually respond to that. And that was also, that was super encouraging because it shows that the dialogue is really moving now, sort of beyond the kind of activist space, beyond, the voices of those who are not being heard, to also those voices that have been being heard, but that now need to take a new stance. And of course, the sustainable companies are the first ones to get on board. But as I say, the investment side of things is really becoming very interested. And of course, the insurance industry as well. And they were telling us, several years ago, we know this is coming. We just don't know when. And we're now starting to hear the same thing out of the mouths of quite conservative politicians. And that's very encouraging. There are now 25 plus countries talking about this at parliamentary or government level. So, yeah, really encouraging developments and the beginnings of real support from certain corporate sectors in particular, but more and more realizing that this framework has huge benefits.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Jojo. And really fascinating to hear that we're changing from being really smart on answering very brightly the wrong questions to start searching for the right ones. So thanks for that. Sophie, how do you think a body like Women Business can perhaps empower corporates to engage in this concept and need of reframing legal structures, as well as also the relationship with policy lobbying?
Women Business is a coalition of 7 founding partners like World Business Council, Sustainable Development, CDP, BSR and others. And what we do is we do 3 things. First, we aggregate and amplify the business voice. To start with, we work with businesses that are doing the 5 Ps, right? Well, we have 4 As, but it's essentially the same. So we're looking for companies that are business leaders. And just for your information, our business pavilion in the blue zone, we only accepted companies that sponsored that have 1.5 line targets, right? So I've turned out a lot of money telling sometimes those companies with a little bit of pleasure, sorry, you're not ambitious enough. Yeah, and we use that business voice then to go out, and we do that through campaign letters or sign-on letters. We've done that for the EU 55 target for 2030, the NDC last year in the US. We've done it for the G20 last year. We've done it just this week for trying to give backing to governments that they should stick to 1.5 and not go backsliding on the commitments made. And it is quite effective, both that, say, Ursula von der Leyen acknowledged in her speech, wow, we got 170 companies backing us, so businesses behind us putting this through, it really helps them. But also for the companies, right? Many companies last year signed a G20 statement about phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and about financing, where they internally had to work out that they could publicly commit to that. So it also pushes companies to go that one step further and say, are we ready to come out? And they're more likely able to do that when there's other companies doing it as well. So that's the one. And then we have bilateral meetings. So we met with Sweden today, Germany yesterday, EU Monday, US on Saturday, where we try and bring a few companies in the room with policymakers to have that direct conversation about where are some of the barriers. They're trying to sense, what backing can we have from businesses in negotiating a pro-climate outcome of the COP, but also the G20, which is happening in parallel. And it's us putting a number of companies and policymakers together that helps. Plus, of course, the communications that takes their voice outside through videos, social media, etc. The second thing is then about that responsibility. We're going to come out with an RPE, or Responsible Policy Engagement Framework, by mid next year that aggregates the various guidelines and toolkits that are around to create one global harmonized framework on what should be the norm, what is responsible policy engagement. Because part of the problem is that we have no way to assess in a neutral, harmonized way, what does it mean and how do we know a company is actually behaving or not? So, and that we can do as a coalition because we have so many partners in there. And the third one is a very exciting new development, and I'm actually going to work on that full-time from 1 January. The missing third gap is that governments need help. Yeah, it's not enough to just tell them, yay, we call on you to phase out fossil fuels or to commit to 1.5. Many policymakers I speak to, they say, well, and now we need to get to the regulations, and where are all those NGOs, right? We need on-the-ground support as well. And so we worked very closely with CDP, who have data from 18,000 companies around the world. And we tested for Germany, Japan, India, and Indonesia. What do the data say that companies have been reporting to them about targets, about their plans, about the share of renewable energy they use in their power mix? And can we use the insights from those data to say, in combination, and we're talking to companies that say, yeah, but that's because we missed this or this or this policy. And then thirdly, take that to the policymakers and say, we've got evidence from across the economy in a specific country, and the companies have confirmed that this and these policies have really helped, but some other policies have not, are still gaps, so that policymakers have the evidence from the real world business to support policy change. Science is needed, it needs to be science-led, but science alone is not going to convince society to do this, right? We need evidence from on the ground. Where it will help business is that if policy gets informed by business evidence, the likelihood that policy is actually going to work on the ground for business is also bigger. So those three things, and yeah, that's where we move business to support policy.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Mark, do you see risks in this endeavor? And if so, which might be those risks?
Well, I mean, everybody in this room knows that this is the only game in town, right? We know we have to go on this journey. This is the action COP, they say. One of the buzzwords that keeps coming out is greenwashing. And I've been calling BS on all of my competitors for years and years and years. And there's a whole bunch of BS going on here as well, outside with some of the suppliers. The problem we have with greenwashing is that we desperately need law to clear that out, because it then means that if you're in finance, you don't have to invest because you can hide behind oh, it's greenwashing, or I'm not going to do anything because it might be greenwashing. So I think we need to be, I got very excited when I heard the word greenwashing, thinking everybody's now got there, but actually I'm quite concerned that it might be something that is going to be a blocker instead. So we absolutely need to be able to take the law and take the language to a place where people can get behind it and move forward. But this is the only game in town. We all have to get involved, and we all need to move faster.
Thanks so much. And to close, Andreas, how can business think about mitigating those risks? And could you share some closing thoughts about your own vision to change the law needs to address?
Yeah, just a few thoughts there. So first of all, I think, and that's also been mentioned before, you really need to lead by example. And that's not just companies themselves, but it's also the advisors, because it's no good advising your company, advising a company on, how to go about their position around carbon neutral, net zero, and whatever, if you haven't walked the walk yourself. So we as a firm called Science-Based Target, one of the few law firms in the world, we're the first law firm in the world to have a corporate PPA. We have a dedicated practice just to certification and offsetting related issues, etc. And we really see when it comes to clients, it's that sort of ability that has also been mentioned before to actually incentivize your staff around doing the right thing, but also helping them to understand what it is that they want to say. And I agree with the sort of the comment made on greenwashing. It is an issue, but again, you also have to be very careful that you're you're not in the way of progress by requiring something that cannot be achieved. Yeah. So a very good example on this for me always is the very progressive companies saying, I'll only do 24/7 renewable energy, right? So all of my energy, has to be renewable. At any point in time, whatever I'm consuming, it needs to be matched at any given settlement period on the grid with the same amount of production. That's great. And having that ambition is great. But where the danger in all of this is that there are quite a lot of companies that cannot fulfill it. And you need to tread very carefully in these areas to still, perhaps in a transition period, not achieve everything, but take companies along and give them the possibility within their means to do what they can. And that's a real important element to that, risk mitigation. It's great setting guardrails. It's also great to really set some rules around, no-go zones in terms of, very serious activities that lead to environmental harm. There's no question about that. But you equally need to give people, and companies in particular, a clear understanding of how they can be compliant. Because one of the big issues that we have is that companies just don't understand, right? That they've got a number of different departments. One's looking after the procurement, one's looking after the legal issue, one's looking after corporate communication, and all of them are looking at this thing in a different way. And they understand risks in a very different way. And there is, and it goes beyond legal rules, it goes beyond, it is fundamentally an education and a risk mitigation exercise with them usually to say, look, this is what you can do reasonably within your means. And in those, in those particular areas, you shouldn't say something because you cannot practically meet that. In those other areas, you should find a way of communicating what it is that you're doing. And but it also requires from consumers, and maybe I close with this, a fair understanding that, as I said before, there are certain things that are difficult to achieve in the short to medium term. And that there needs to be some recognition, like with renewables, that it's just not possible to say that you consumed renewable energy unless you only produce when the sun's shining and you've got solar on your roof. It's just not possible. But you can find a way of communicating what you're doing in a way that this is as much as I can reasonably do in the given circumstances, and I have an ambition to do more if technology or financial circumstances or regulation allows me to do so. And that's fundamentally important, finding that balance to take companies along, because just incentive is not the solution. Just stick is also not the solution, right? And it's a transition process, and everybody needs to recognize that.
Thanks so much, Andreas, Jojo, Mark, Sophie. Definitely is the most important game. This is the game. You're playing it. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening, for attending. Join me for a round of applause to our panelists. And I will hand back the microphone to Georgie. Thanks so much.
Essentially what we do is mobilise commercial lawyers, law firms, and ideally the law to accelerate the transition to net zero. And I'm super pleased to see some of our members in the audience. I see some Clyde & Co representatives. We heard from DLA Piper, McFarlane's as well, so thank you for coming and supporting. I'd like to introduce you to our panellists today. We have Lucy Maxwell, who's the co-director of the Climate Litigation Network at the Uganda Foundation. Lucy is a human rights and climate change lawyer, and we'll be talking all things climate litigation today. And we also have Moritz Dolmans, partner at Clary Gottlieb, and the expert on competition law and sustainability. Moritz is also a treasured member of our NZLA Competition Advisory Group. So we're going to start with a bit of a discussion on competition law. Moritz, can you set the scene for us? It's a bit of a hot topic at the moment. You might have seen it in some media outlets on the regular. So we're going to get the real deal today. So set the scene, yes. Should competitors be allowed to cooperate to achieve climate goals? And where does competition fit in with all this? Where does competition law fit in?
Indeed, we are talking today about how should the law adapt, or how should policy adapt when the law already allows you to adapt the policy. And it's very important for Race to Zero because it's a coalition of private entities trying to do the right thing. And that's where competition law comes in. Now, I will express my own views here. When I started as a young lawyer, I was taught that markets were always right, that market forces always drive the best allocation of resources, and that consumers get the best product for the lowest price as a result of market forces. And I was taught that antitrust laws should protect this process. Now, the reality is that markets fail, in particular when it concerns climate change. And this is very important for competition law. So firms pay for raw materials and for labor, but they do not pay for the greenhouse gases that they spew out into the atmosphere. So the resulting cost to society of extreme weather events and global warming are not included in most cases in the price of the products and the services that you pay. Economists call these externalities. And it has two consequences. First, because there is no price for these emissions, the producers have no incentives to cut them, or inadequate incentives to cut them. And second, in spite of the intentions of competition and antitrust policies, consumers do not get the best deal. There are hidden costs to production and to consumption. So we are trapped in these market failures, because even if firms realize that the dangers of climate change, market forces discourage them, or can discourage them, from doing the right thing. They fear that cutting emissions will include costs, and that means they have to raise their prices. When they raise their prices, their competitors undercut them. This is what is also sometimes called a collective action problem. Everybody would be better off if everybody else cut emissions, but nobody does it for fear that everybody else would free ride on them, right? So this is competition traps market players in a climate prisoner's dilemma. It's competition, unmitigated competition, that drives us down the road to climate hell. Eminent economist Sir Nicholas Stern, I don't have this is not my own thinking. Sir Nicholas Stern, who wrote very important reports on climate change, says that climate change is the result of the greatest market failure that the world has ever seen. Now, competition policy must take account of this, otherwise it makes no sense. So the best way out of a collective action problem is, of course, coordination. Coordination through regulation, through carbon taxation, and sure, we as lawyers have an obligation to push for that in order for society to get out of these collective action problems. But let's be realistic for a moment. It's not happening fast enough, it's not happening enough, and it's not being done worldwide. And that's where And so in other words, we have also not just market failure, but also regulatory failure. And that is where private cooperation comes in. We and the market players have an obligation to cooperate privately. If we can't do what we must, then lawyers at least must do what we can. And what can we do? Well, push for regulation, carbon taxation, education, litigation, reforestation, innovation, but also cooperation in the private sector. And climate change is an existential threat, and so we have to pull out all these stops. Now, at COP26, we tried this. There was the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which was set up by Mark Carney, and they agreed that they, or at least they wanted to agree, to follow the principles of Race to Zero, which is no new investment in unabated coal power plants. There's a load of other criteria, but I'll pick on this one because it's the most controversial one, right? But, as mentioned earlier, a bunch of politicians and vested interests used competition law as a stick in order, and said this is a violation of antitrust law. And are those critics right? I think not. And if you apply normal economic thinking to competition policy, you come to that conclusion. So first, competition law, antitrust law, is about preventing companies from colluding in order to raise their profits. Are these participants in a Race to Zero agreement colluding to raise their profits? No, they are foregoing profits, which is exactly the opposite. Second, this is an agreement which is beyond suspicion. Normally, if companies set their own goals, you have to check, right? You have to test, trust, but verify. And but in this case, the goals of no new unabated coal power plants were set by the International Energy Agency, which has done a very thorough roadmap for global energy and has set a number of milestones, and this is the first milestone. Without this milestone, we cannot meet the 1.5 goal. And if you look at the environment now at 1.2 degrees of heating, imagine where we are at 5, and imagine where we will be if we don't meet 1.5. Third, the agreement is necessary. In other words, there is no less restrictive alternative. And this is confirmed again by the International Energy Agency roadmap that I just discussed. Without this first milestone, we cannot meet the Paris Agreement. Most importantly, the agreement serves to resolve a collective action problem. The idea is that we all benefit, every bank benefits from avoiding the discounted damage of climate crisis, and that is worth more than the short-term profits, right? And if everybody realizes that, then we will possibly be able to get out of the climate crisis. But none of them would act alone for fear that others would free ride on them. And that's why this agreement was set up. So this is very clearly, in my view, the right thing to do. To prohibit a no new coal agreement would preserve the greatest market failure that the world has ever experienced and damn the consequences. And this can't be right. In antitrust, if antitrust law prevents us from doing what is necessary for our society, for our economy, for each of us, and also companies and businesses to survive, then, to quote Charles Dickens, the law is an ass. And it's the law and the policy has to adapt to the climate crisis. Human laws have to adapt to the laws of nature. Thank you.
Thanks, Moritz. Thank you so much, Moritz. And I also think you might potentially have some comments on what Lucy's going to cover, including some of the judgments that have been coming out of Dutch courts. But Lucy, can you set us up for a bit of a discussion on litigation?
We go. I think that's working now. Great. It's wonderful to be here with you all today. My name is Lucy Maxwell, and I'm the co-director of the Climate Litigation Network. we work with communities around the world and their legal teams to bring ambitious climate cases against their national governments to ramp up their mitigation ambition. And we're a project of the Your Agenda Foundation, a Dutch sustainability organisation that many of you in the room may have heard of because they successfully, together with 900 Dutch residents, sued the Dutch government in the first case globally to find that a government has a legal obligation to mitigate climate change. And it's that case that sparked a wave of cases around the world. So I'm here today and I've been asked to talk about the breakthroughs that have happened in the 7 years since that first Dutch decision in law, that have happened in climate cases against governments, and what that shows us is possible in terms of the role of the law in combating the climate crisis when it comes to the responsibility of non-state actors. Whenever we're talking about the role of law and responses to the climate crisis, I have to, for myself, centre it with a brief reminder of how pressing the crisis is. Because there's been some discussion already about, well, what's possible, and we have to be reasonable, and it's a transition. But I think it just underscores the reason why communities are turning to the courts, the degree of the crisis. We've heard from the UN in the latest reports 2 weeks ago, we're still on track to 2.5 to 2.7 degrees warming. The UNEP emissions gap report indicated that current plans, and I quote, are woefully insufficient to meet the Paris targets. The production gap report indicates we are way, way in excess planning for oil and gas beyond a 1.5 degree budget. So it's in that context that communities are turning to the courts. And what I'm going to talk about today are 4 trends from the government climate litigation world, which I think offer a clear set of lessons for corporate legal accountability and what might be possible in that sector in which the litigation side is still more nascent. So the first trend to be aware of, and the first lesson, I guess, from the state-based climate cases is the sheer number of them in the last 7 years. From that first case filed in 2013, in cases against governments that challenge their overall mitigation effort, so they're called framework cases or systemic cases, there are now 80 of those worldwide. Against the most responsible, highest emitting governments, there are 30 of those cases that have been filed, and a third are still pending before courts, so it's a rapidly emerging area. The second lesson is, well, what's the success rate of these cases? Have they worked? Where are they at? What have courts been doing? A recent study by the London School of Economics and Political Science, which looked at this category of climate cases, found that 9 of them have gone to the highest courts at the national level, and 7 have been successful. So when you take the constitutional courts, the Supreme Courts that are hearing these cases, they're being upheld. And on that basis, the London School of Economics concluded, based on the current cases that have been heard by courts, and I quote, "Government entities at all levels should anticipate the emergence of legal duties to act on climate change." The third lesson from government climate litigation is how courts have handled the nitty-gritty of legal questions. Very similar questions arise in a number of the corporate legal strategies. So I'll talk you through just a couple of things that national courts have done in these cases. A large number of the framework cases against governments look at a state's obligations under tort law or human rights law to protect people within their jurisdiction. What courts have said is that the fact that climate change is subject to political decision-making, international decision-making and political processes like we're in right now, does not prevent legal adjudication of a state's mitigation efforts. Questions around separation of powers and justiciability have not been a barrier to legal adjudication. And here I'm talking primarily of decisions of courts in the Netherlands, in Ireland, in Germany, Belgium, Canada in the Mehta case, Colombia, France and Nepal. There are indeed a handful of cases in North America in which separation of powers has been a barrier, but overwhelmingly that has not been the case. When courts have looked at the existing legal instruments under tort law and human rights law that states have to comply by, they have found that they can be applied to the context of climate change. And the fact that it's a global commons problem, as we heard, the fact that a large degree of the harms have not yet been realised, does not preclude legal adjudication. That's been another really important building block that's been established. The third building block in these cases is that courts have not accepted the argument that governments frequently make and that many companies make, that their national emissions, when looked at on a global scale, are just a drop in the ocean. No court has accepted that as a legitimate defence to legal challenge. Instead, courts have reinforced again and again that there is an individual responsibility to mitigate, given that states, and I would argue companies, have known of the science, have responsibilities not to harm those where their activities could do so, and they must act in accordance with that science. So those three things, separation of powers, existing legal duties applied to climate change, and the fact that it's a global commons problem does not preclude causation, have been well established by courts in government climate cases. The fourth and final lesson from government climate litigation is that effective climate litigation can lead to real-world emissions reductions. There have been decades of promises, decades of talks, and yet until we get some hard, binding orders, it can be very hard to push states to increase their ambition. But what we've seen, and I hear again a quote from the LAC report, which I'd recommend to any of you who want to dive deep into these cases, and I quote here, significant changes in national climate policy, end quote, have resulted from successful rulings against governments in climate cases. We've seen in the Netherlands, for example, as a result of the Urgenda case, a cap on coal-fired power production, a new climate change act, and then billions of euros in emissions reduction measures in order to comply with a court order. Last year, when the German Constitutional Court issued its decision against the German government regarding its 2030 and post-2030 plans, what followed was, within 2 weeks, an immediate change in Germany's 2030 target, a 10% increase in that emissions reduction target. So climate litigation is a last resort, but when it is used, and it is used effectively, it can result in real-world emissions reductions. And that's what communities are looking for right now. So with those 4 lessons from the world of government climate litigation, what can we expect in terms of legal strategies against companies of all kinds? I think one thing I'd like to sort of highlight for your imagination is just the range of legal strategies that communities and their legal teams are looking at in terms of non-state actors. And in particular, while for many years a lot of the focus has been on greenwashing, basically, don't say something you can't deliver, we need to move beyond that. Because as we've heard, if you only ask people to do what's possible, what they think is possible, you may end up having very minimal action. So there is indeed an increasing number of greenwashing cases, and they're using consumer law, and increasingly they're looking at the rigour of net zero targets, and that is indeed important. But what we're seeing moreover is substantive challenges to the substance of companies' emissions reduction plans. So here, for example, I'm thinking of the decision of the Hague District Court in the Netherlands in the Shell case last year, the first court case in the world to find that a company has its own duty to reduce its emissions, not just to say truthful things. And I think that's going to be crucially important. We see the French duty of vigilance law using a business and human rights framework to look at the substance of companies' supply chains and the extent to which they're involved in matters like deforestation, which contribute to the climate crisis. I'll leave it that on that note, in the sense of the range of legal strategies that are being used, tort law, consumer law, and the business and human rights framework. And really we have to wait and see the extent to which legal teams will be inspired by the breakthroughs that courts have made in government cases, where they've made decisions that really no one thought would be possible a decade ago. Courts have risen to the challenge, applied existing legal tools, and we can see results in terms of emissions reductions. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lucy. All right, we have a few minutes left, and I think actually better than me asking questions, let's turn it to the audience. We have these amazing experts, so let's hear all the information. Yes, down the back.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought I was going to have to shout then. Hi, I'm Emily Faint, and I work on the ISO Net Zero guidelines, so I'm from the international standards world. And I think I speak for many people who are involved in sort of the voluntary initiative side of climate action. When I ask particularly to Lucy, how can voluntary initiatives work most effectively with climate litigation experts to make sure that as new innovations and new best practice emerges in this space, we can sort of protect and defend it against those who are trying to quash those innovations, but also make sure that we give climate litigation experts a heads up on what these new innovations could bring to court?
Thanks, that's a great question. And it is fantastic to see such momentum in the last week on standards around net zero commitments. I'm also thinking of the UN High-Level Expert Group report and the one from the ISO. It's fantastic. That's exactly what we need in terms of getting specific about what it means to have a rigorous net zero strategy. I think a key role that voluntary mechanisms can play is ensuring that they consult experts when they're designing their standards, and that there's a degree of an internal compliance mechanism that is robust. You've consulted civil society organisations, so it's got scientific expert, it's got civil society input, and it's got its own compliance mechanism. Because I think one of the worst things is standards to which companies can sign up and then there's no assessment, no accountability, and that's basically worse than nothing, I think, because it would give the impression of action when there is none. So I would probably put it back to the voluntary mechanisms and ask, how do you think accountability can work with your mechanism if it's a non-legal, non-binding mechanism? But I think it's fantastic in general that there's such momentum around the need for specifying what real net zero and what an appropriate net zero pledge looks like.
Thank you, great question. Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, can we have a mic over here, please?
Hi, yeah, thanks for doing this. I am currently at the University of Michigan, but I come from the retail industry, and I think one of the issues around antitrust that I'd seen in the past had been with fashion houses back in, I think it was 2020, they had tried to come together to reduce their seasons, as well as to reduce discounts in an effort to go towards a more sustainable fashion industry. And I wanted to dig into more about what companies can do with this issue of antitrust coming about in terms of cooperation to avoid being considered a cartel.
Moritz.
Thank you very much. Indeed, a very good question, a very topical one, because the European Commission raided a number of fashion houses recently, precisely associated with this particular agreement. I think there are two aspects to this, and it basically shows that some companies can use sustainability as an excuse to rig the market. Now, for instance, this particular agreement, I don't know all the factual details, so I have to be a little bit careful, but when you use the words not give discounts, that triggers immediate reaction in the mind of an antitrust lawyer, because that sounds like an attempt to raise your profit margins by collusion and preventing price competition. On the other hand, for instance, the suggestion that you might not use, that you might use textiles from renewable sources to standardize around renewable materials, to standardize about fair payment to workers instead of the minimum payments in the sweatshops that sometimes are being used. Those can be pro-competitive arrangement, and the German antitrust authorities, for instance, have looked at some of this. The idea that you perhaps should not have a new series of fashion, as you can see, I'm not really the arbiter in the elegancier of fashion, but the idea that you should have every year 2 or 3 rounds of new fashion, is that really necessary? Now, that is on the edge, and the kind of criteria that I mentioned earlier for the net zero agreement also apply to this kind of agreements. Is this an agreement designed to raise your profit margins? That's suspicious, because you may be trying to rip off consumers. Is this an agreement trying to avoid a race down to the bottom where somebody says, I need a new, what do you call it, this portfolio, a new
Portfolio
new portfolio of clothes every 6 months. Somebody else says, okay, I will do it every 4 months. And somebody else said, I'll do it every 3 months. And you get a round of downward spiral to a situation where there's overproduction and overconsumption, where a lot of clothes are being shredded at the end of a 3-month season. You know, that kind of agreement might resolve a market failure, a collective action problem. So apply those criteria and you can distinguish the good from the bad agreements.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I'd say engage legal counsel who get it, who understand where there's a, say, net zero ambition and can support you to fulfill that ambition, to take action within the law. So get a lawyer like Moritz.
I didn't pay you for that.
Any more questions? Yeah, over here.
Delphine Mison, Université Saint-Louis, Brussels. I'd like you to raise the issue of access to justice, because in your strategies you mention substantial dimensions, but of course in the world audience we need to care about the enlargement of access to justice, and maybe also on competition issues. Are there some features to learn about?
I think it's a very valid point. I think we heard from the very first speaker who gave a stirring introduction about affected communities need to be part of the design of the law and the design of legal strategies. And I think the same applies to accessing legal advice and access to the courts to pursue litigation strategies. I think at the moment, the way it seems to be operating is a very organic structure in which small grassroots organisations at the national level throughout the world, Global South and Global North, are seeing litigation as one of the tools they can use. And the main way they're able to access courts is where lawyers are willing to work for free. But in some jurisdictions, the risk of a costs order when you lose a case is a very significant barrier. And in others, for example, in the Netherlands, where the first such case was filed, there is not a very prohibitive costs regime. So if you lose a case, you're not bankrupt. But certainly in other countries, either there isn't an active pro bono system, so lawyers can't work for free, or the costs are too high if you risk losing. So there's a real role for law firms around the world to offer pro bono services to communities to access the courts.
I might add, I should compliment Urgenda and that group for class actions, right? Because there are always, also in antitrust law, there are increasingly systems for class actions where a representative plaintiff makes a claim for an entire class of persons that have been damaged. And so that exists in the Netherlands. And there are various clever ways of organizing these kind of class actions. So the Urgenda case is a very good example of how to get access to justice in a way. Class action, if you need to be reimbursed in accordance with the kind of a polluter pays principle, a class action is a possibility.
We might have to end it there. We are over time due to my poor moderating, sorry Fee. But so I'm sure we can pick up this conversation after this event. So can we thank our two panelists, Lucy and Moritz, for their time. Thank you so much, I really appreciate it. Okay. Fantastic.
Thanks everyone. Thank you for joining. Our next session will start here in about 5 minutes.
I do have some closing remarks. If we have time, you can stay on stage. Keep me company. So I want to thank all our speakers from today. I think something that concerns me is often lawyers and the law are not a focus of conversation at events such as COP. And so it's been very heartening this year to see events such as this one which have really put the law at the centre of the discussion, because our lawyers are advising on systems and transition, so they are a key piece to the puzzle. To the lawyers in the room, I actually want to speak directly to you now. Today we've established that you, as professional service providers, play a pretty unique role in transition. So unlike other non-state actors, unlike your clients who are going to be having their impact through their decarbonisation, of course it's important for law firms as well, but really it's taking a good hard look at the impact of the advice that you're providing. So it is time to put the idea of net zero aligned legal services into practice. We really need to create a new norm. You might be thinking, yeah, we've heard about competition law, we've heard about litigation. My practice group is pretty safe. You know, I can keep on trucking on BAU. I'm just going to stop you right there and say, let's nip that thought in the bud. Every group, practice group, is touched by climate change, and your advice is going to have an impact on transition. Now, I did have a visual, but I'm not super technical and we couldn't download it. So we're going to need to use our imagination here. Feel free to close your eyes. So I want you to imagine the law as a deck of cards. And each separate card is a different practice group, yeah? So this year and over the past few years, we've seen a couple cards be flipped over. So we've seen competition, antitrust laws be flipped over. We've seen the card of litigation be flipped over. We can see the intersect between climate and those practice groups, yeah? It's pretty evident for us all to see. The problem is there's a whole deck of cards, yeah? And we are just waiting for each card to be flipped over one by one. So if you're a lawyer, we really need you to understand your card. We need you to understand how to provide net zero aligned legal services, and we need you to understand how we can shift, sorry, there's a very curious flyer, how we can shift the dial to unlock greater ambition, so how we can shift those same legal frameworks, yeah? So please, I almost want to say it as your duty to your client in terms of understanding climate-related risks. It is your duty to the planet as a whole to understand your card. Now, I do want to end by some words of a fellow New Zealander, actually from last COP. I don't want to be misquoting. So she's India Logan Riley, and she spoke last year to COP26, and she said pretty simply, and I want to reiterate, get in line or get out of the way. So this is my ask for you, understand your card, or thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Race to Zero and to all our speakers today. Thank you.